Hi, I'm Caitlin, and this is Book Chats. And today's Top 5 Wednesday is our top 5 favorite retellings. So I realized two things when I was making this list. The first thing I realized is that I went through this huge phase where I read a ton of fairy tales and fairy tale retellings, and most of that happened before I started using Goodreads. And Goodreads is how I keep track of things when I'm doing my Top 5 Wednesdays. So I was like, oh, I can't remember how many of those I read in high school and what they were, so they just aren't on the list. The other thing I realized is that even though that's true, I still had a really hard time narrowing it down. So I eventually decided that if a book was something that I liked for elements that were outside of the retelling itself, that I would take it off the list. And I also decided to take things off the list that I have probably already mentioned on my channel or will probably come up again. So doing that, I was able to narrow it down to 5. So book number 5 is The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. So I love this book a lot for multiple reasons. I, in fact, actually own 2 copies of this book. I have the ebook, so I can read it whenever I feel like it, and I have a hard copy that lives actually in Minnesota right now. But anyway, what I love about this book is that it's a really smart, interesting retelling of The Goose Girl, which is a pretty standard fairy tale that we've heard before. So like you wouldn't think there would be an unusual and interesting new way to do it, but it is. And then also that is so like original and interesting that it actually spawns off this whole series of original books later that are all in the same, they're called the Books of Bayern, and they're in the same world as a Goose Girl, and some characters cameo in them. And that to me was just so interesting about this book, is that it really was so unique even within the framework and using what was already there in the story. Then book number 4 is one that I swear, guys, I would have loved to have written when I was going through this phase where I was reading so many fairy tales in high school and middle school, and that is Enchanted by Althea Contis. I think that this started, if I remember correctly, because she was writing, like, someone dared her to, like, write something with as many incorporating as many, like, challenges as she could, like different tropes from different fairy tales. And so it's not per se a straight retelling of a fairy tale, it's just like a new fairy tale that has like every trope you can imagine somehow worked in, and like every reference to like every fairy tale you've read. Like I read so many fairy tale books as a kid, and like reading this was just like full of Easter eggs and so wonderful. And it also has sequels, which I have not actually read, so eventually I'll get to them. But Enchanted by Althea Contis. Book number 3 is not a retelling of fairy tales. I think it's actually my only non-fairy tale retelling on this list, although I had other ones on my long list. And that is The Air Affair by Jasper Fforde, I think is how you say his name. I always say Fforde because there's 2 Fs, but I think that's just a weird thing that I do and not actual reality. So The Air Affair I love for a couple of reasons. One, it's like the way that Enchanted is full of Easter eggs for people who read a lot of fairy tales. That is how The Air Affair is for people who like had to read a lot of classics and like English literature. And so it's not everything that that is in it is something I have read, but some of it is, and I really loved it and thought it was great. But what I love is that it's hard to explain what it's really a retelling of, because it's kind of isn't a retelling, or it has a large part of the plot has to do with Jane Eyre, except it's not Jane Eyre as we know it. It's Jane Eyre with a different ending, and throughout the course of the book we find out why that Jane Eyre is different, and like just things happen, and it's hard to explain without spoiling things, but basically it's just very smart, it's very witty, it's like a sci-fi comedy, but it's sci-fi in that it's like a parallel universe or a parallel history, not necessarily, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but it's hilarious, wonderful, and like a huge reward for English nerds or people who were English majors. So book number 2 is one that has a very similar title to book number 4, but they're not the same, and it is Enchantment by Orson Scott Card. I know what you're thinking. Orson Scott Card is that sci-fi writer who wrote things like Ender's Game and Xenophobia. What is he doing on this list of retellings? Well, guys, oh my goodness. One of my close friends and roommates introduced me to this book in college, and I love it, and it's amazing. It is a kind of loose retelling of like a Sleeping Beauty style myth, and also involves kind of like time travel-y aspects, and what I love about it is that it just feels so real, even to the aspect of like the main character who lives in our time, who ends up like finding this Sleeping Beauty character and then being transported back to her time. He only can vaguely understand what's being said to him because he happens to have majored in like this obscure language that is like the predecessor of a current language. Like, just like it like explains that. It has just like a very slow burn romance. If you guys are all about that slow burn romance, like it has that in spades. It has an appearance by Baba Yaga, who is one of my friend's favorite villains in fairy tales. It is just a really delightful and interesting and not at all what you would expect from an Orson Scott Card, and I really challenge you to pick it up. And if you don't want to support Orson Scott Card, you can always pick it up from your library instead of purchasing a copy, but I really like Enchantment. And then my number one book is one that when I read this book, guys, I felt like I was reading a piece of my childhood in literary form, and I've been really lucky and actually been able to meet this author, and I told her that. I was like, I felt like I was reading my childhood, and she was kind of like, thanks. There's a multitude of reasons why, and one thing that you have to understand is, so this book is kind of it's a retelling of the Snow Queen, and it also has cameos from a lot of other Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales in it, and that matters to it feeling like my childhood, because I was that girl who in elementary school decided that she was going to pick the really fat book on the shelf to read, and she was going to read the complete tales of Hans Christian Andersen. So like I was going to read every fairy tale he ever wrote, which like Hans Christian Andersen actually straight up wrote a lot of things that we think of as like fairy tales that are familiar to us, like The Little Match Girl and The Little Mermaid. Like he didn't collect them written by other people, like he straight up wrote them, but they're not necessarily the way we remember them or have them told to us by Disney. And also, like, Hans Christian Andersen has a lot of, like, theological kind of little fairy tales written in there, which aren't really referenced in Breadcrumbs. But anyway, the point is, when I was, like, in elementary school, I was convinced I was going to read all 501 pages of this complete Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. I made it about halfway through before I gave up, because, like, let's be real, guys, there's only so much you can take of that. But when I read this book, I felt like all of that was coming back, and all of those weird little things I read were coming back. So that is one reason it felt like my childhood. And the other reason is that it is set in Minnesota, and it's set in Minnesota in the winter, and there's a lot of just like cultural aspects that ring very true to my childhood experience in Minnesota in the winter. Anyway, this book that I've not told you the title of yet is Breadcrumbs by Anne Ursu. It is so good. I know that objectively a lot of people prefer her book that was National Book Award longlisted, which is The Real Boy, but I personally prefer Breadcrumbs because it reminds me of my childhood, and it is retelling. The Real Boy is not a retelling. Anyway, I love this book so much. I can't really translate to you why it is so amazing, but it is very well written. Like, other people would also think it's good, but it's like, if you should choose to read it, it's like my childhood in book form. Like, I can't convey it in any better way, but I just really love this book. And if you guys haven't heard of Anne Ursu, she's a really cool author. She actually writes middle grade, and it's very good, very high quality middle grade, but she also is pretty active in kind of like the online community of YA / middle grade / like writers who write for children, authors. And she has a great Tumblr where she talks about some issues that come up a little bit more in like YA and like kind of the reaction to them and kind of popular like things that people are doing around them. And it's really interesting and really cool. I often really feel like I learn or have a new or interesting perspective presented to me by reading her Tumblr. Anyway, those are my top 5 favorite retellings. More than anything, I'm very excited to hear what you guys have to say about this topic. I'm super excited to hear what retellings you like. Are you kind of more in the fairy tale retelling side of things like I am, or do you have retellings of like classics that you enjoy, or myths or biblical stories? Like, what are the retellings that just make you happy? Leave them down below, or let me know if you did this video yourself, and I totally want all the recommendations, because I just realized in like compiling this that I am hungry for more retellings, guys. I am hungry for more. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye!